Merry Christmas, and welcome to Episode 1 of the Zoo Files, a series where I seek to do my part in helping to bring into the light some of the sickest individuals both on and off the internet. I'm not going to commit myself to any sort of schedule for this series, as the topic does take a significant toll on the mind and liver, but I do hope to make semi-regular installments on the channel. For the time being, including this video, I have 2, potentially 3 videos that will be out within a few weeks of this one, which will be followed by a break from this subject. I suppose you could consider this a limited series with the potential for a sequel. Hopefully, between the puking and the rage, we can all have a few laughs as well, and perhaps even make a positive impact, however small, in the lives of the people and animals that these sick freaks spend their lives abusing. As we navigate throughout this series, I'm going to repeat this disclaimer. No one on the internet is a hero. If you come across information about these people that could lead to their identification and arrest, keep your mouth shut and go straight to the police. There will be plenty of time to revel in their misery after they're thrown in a prison cell and their victims are safe and sound. I have no intention of going on a crusade with these videos, however justified it may be. If I stumble across incriminating information, I will quietly pass it along to the authorities. The purpose of this series is to shed a light on the dangerous people abusing animals, and often children, unimpeded right before our eyes. As with many other videos on this channel, a special thanks goes out to the users, staff, and High Chancellor of Kiwi Farms for the untold hours of work they've put in researching and exposing these monsters. For the first few installments, I will be covering a variety of interconnected characters and their disgusting crimes against God, man, and beast, all centered around one man who can be considered one of the most infamous zoophiles of the last decade, a man that was integral in establishing the nightmarish hellscape that is the zoophile community today. The content of this video is graphic, disturbing, and highly upsetting. Viewer discretion is advised. Zooier Than Thou is a podcast that promotes animal abuse under the guise of advocating for loving and healthy relationships between humans and their pets. If that sounds a bit confusing, a quick look at the About section of their YouTube page is all you really need to know about the vile creatures that host this show. Zooier Than Thou is yet another monthly podcast covering the zoophile community and all things zooey and wonderful, featuring current events, dating advice, and insider tips on rubbing shoulders with the Zooluminati elite. All with a great deal of silliness, Zooier Than Thou sets itself apart from the pack with an openly positive and joyful interpretation of what it is to be a zoophile. The juvenile attempt at levity in this description makes it all the more disturbing. Now, it's at this point in the video where most YouTubers would launch into a pedantic, drawn-out explanation about why it's not okay to rape animals. Personally, I'm not going to do that. Call me crazy, but in my experience, the vast majority of people don't really need some dipshit that parades around with an anime avatar explaining to them why they shouldn't go balls deep into the family dog. That's just one of those things that seems to be hardwired into our brains. Instead, I'm just going to give everyone a little glimpse of what is, at the time of recording this, currently available on YouTube for anyone to go and watch. In their flagship episode, titled Zooier Than Thou, The Exposure Solution, we're introduced to the original co-hosts, who use the pseudonyms Fausty and Toggle. The first episode was actually an attempt to troll their fellow zoophiles. It was also one of Fausty's countless attempts to seek attention, a lifelong habit. On March 7th of 2019, the account Exposure Solution was created on Twitter. Immediately, the account tweeted out the following thread. On March 20th, 2019, we will be launching a podcast, the first of its kind, dedicated to exposing the zoo community for what it is. We want outrage. Help spread the word. We're going to start a movement and change the conversation forever. Join the hashtag hate party. How do you join the hashtag hate party? Easy. Use the hashtag hate party tag on Twitter. Follow us and check out our site, expose.id. Tell everyone exactly what you think about Zoofiles. And of course, tune in to the first episode of our podcast, The Exposure Solution, on March 20th. So the idea here is that those they dub Zoophiles would eagerly expose themselves as hateful bigots by tweeting about their disdain for animal rape under the hashtag. A pointless endeavor, as no one who wants animal rapists punished for their crimes is shy about admitting it. They would go on to claim that in their first episode, they would be outing a mainstream celebrity that was a closet zoophile. Naturally, among this community of sexually deviant criminals, outing is considered unforgivable and dangerous to the safety of its members. Their fellow zoophiles, the few who noticed, lost their collective minds at the prospect of a project that sought to strip away their anonymity, with Fausti fanning the faux flames of the LARP with his numerous Twitter accounts. For everyone else, the sentiment was as it always is when apparent fedora-tipping crusaders rear their heads in an attempt to gain clout off of exposing disgusting and heinous crimes on the internet. Keep your mouth shut and go to the police if you have any information that may lead to the arrest of animal abusers. With the launch of Episode 1 on March 20th of 2019, all pretense was dropped. The secret zoophile they were outing was Gandalf's steed, Shadowfax.
The first zoophile to be exposed is a household name in the fantasy community. He's even appeared in movies, on television, and has had roles in video games. This zoophile is the Lord of Horses himself, Shadowfax!
Now, that is high-level trolling. The first episode is little more than a brief introduction to the degenerate duo, Fausti and Toggle, a plethora of poorly written jokes, bitching about a site called the Beast Forums. It should be no surprise that there's a tremendous amount of infighting among the animal raping community, and bragging about how they outed and exposed bigoted zoophobes with their pathetic little PR stunt.
With any luck, some of you are here because you heard about us from our unwitting supporters who participated in the Hate Party campaign.
Indeed. I just want to give a big thanks to all of the anti-zoo bigots who have helped to promote and encourage others to take a look at our podcast. I have to say that was totally unintentional. Very sorry about the confusion. Boy, we sure do appreciate it all the same.
And I hope you were reading between the lines, because every message in those Hate Party tweets was absolutely true.
Even if these guys weren't regularly raping animals, I'd still advocate for both of them to be indefinitely confined inside of a high school locker. The justification for their crimes, as you might imagine, is batshit insane. And they're obviously trying to convince themselves that they aren't monsters just as much as they are the sane population. They claim that what they are engaging in is actually the only true way to respect animal rights, by giving them the same exact rights as humans, including the right to consent to sex with humans, which is, of course, impossible, given that the smartest animal is less intelligent than a child by orders of magnitude that I can't even begin to describe.
Zoos, we've always known better, though. It's not about the humans, it's about everybody. So with this podcast, what we're really all about is celebrating primarily the non-human side of things. Their agency, their wisdom, their interests, and above all else, the well-being of the non-humans that share our lives. Mm-hmm. They do deserve their own voice. More than that, they deserve to have their agency and their adulthood both respected and embraced.
The real abusers, they say, are the people who seek to spay or neuter their pets, taking away their sexual autonomy and depriving them of the loving interspecies relationships that they so desperately crave.
To castrate them, to mutilate them, to literally cut off the adult parts of them, a purely non-consensual violence towards victims who are completely unable to defend their own bodies from these attacks. All of these terrible, terrible things we do to other species serve to reinforce a frankly evil worldview that sees animals as sexless, powerless, childish, forever enslaved, quote unquote, lower beings. Everything about that is just awful. It really reflects the worst of humanity's self-centered, solipsistic, self-important bullshit.
This seems so absurd that at first you might think it's some sort of troll or bizarre piece of performance art. I sure did, and I wish it were the case. Unfortunately, you can rest assured that every member of this podcast is completely genuine, and they expect the people they dub zoophobes to take their arguments seriously. They unironically believe that people are afraid of zoophiles because they are scared of their challenge to the status quo.
When you see people out there touting hate speech against zoophiles, it's because we upset the order of things.
Absolutely true. We as zoos directly challenge the assumed separation of humans from everybody else who shares residency on this planet with us. As zoos, we undermine that imaginary distancing by truly and genuinely embracing our non-human colleagues as equals, as friends, as partners. By our very existence as zoos, we destroy that false placement of humans as separate or above everybody else. Normals may think they're better than mere quote-unquote animals. Well, sorry, zoos know better than all that.
In case it's not clear to any of you zoophiles that are undoubtedly listening, no one is scared of you personally. People are terrified of what you are actively doing to innocent animals, and in many, if not all cases, children as well. Your paraphilia is not now, nor will it ever be, a sexuality. It's a mental disorder. You all know this, it's why you do your best to remain anonymous. There is no debate to be had here, no challenge to the status quo. The only debate is on how severe your punishment should be when you're inevitably outed and caught. The freak with a voice like nails on a chalkboard is called Toggle, and as far as I can tell, he remains anonymous to this day. As with most online predators, it's only a matter of time before he slips up. Opposite Toggle is his co-host and the brains of the operation, Fausty, and he's actually rather infamous. He made no effort in hiding his identity, as he was outed many years ago, exposed for what he is to the entire world. His name is Douglas Brian Spink. On Kiwi Farms, the leading forum for exposing zoophiles and zoo sadists, the author of his OP describes Spink as, quote, perhaps the most ardent zoophilia defender and practitioner in modern history. And despite my relative ignorance on the subject due to the fact that it increases my whiskey intake to dangerous levels, I'm inclined to agree. His high intelligence and utter lack of empathy once made him an incredibly dangerous threat to society. But his arrogant overconfidence, habitual drug abuse, and severe mental illness would see him behind bars or under the thumb of the US government for the majority of his adult life. Much of the information I managed to glean about his early life is sourced directly from Spink himself via a book called Uniquely Dangerous, which I read in full and plan to review at a later date on this channel as the third part of this series. It's essentially zoophilia apologetics written under the guise of objective journalism by a severely emotionally damaged woman named Corinne Maloney. While some facts have been backed up by unbiased and relatively trustworthy sources, for the more personal claims, keep in mind that this man is widely regarded as a pathological liar, so the veracity of his claims must always be taken with a metric ton of salt. Douglas Brian Spink was blessed with a relatively exceptional start to life. Born in Pennsylvania in 1971 to wealthy parents, he was raised in the Fox Chapel suburb of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He grew up neighbors with Mr. Rogers, often riding horses on or exploring the man's property. He was a strange and distant child with few friends, and at some point he was diagnosed with a neurodevelopmental disorder that would later be identified as Asperger's. He also claims to suffer from prosopagnosia, a disorder which makes it nearly impossible to commit human faces to memory. Like so many other psychosexual abusers, it's believed that he himself was subject to sexual molestation, and indeed, he claims to have been. It was at the hands of a male family friend at the young age of 8. In order to cope with the trauma of what happened, he imagined that it was not the man who had abused him, but the man's pet snake. Perhaps this early experience shaped him into the monster he would become. Then again, it could just be one of the numerous fabrications he fed his misguided biographer in order to garner her sympathy. He claims that his first sexual experience was the serial raping of a neighbor's golden retriever over the period of many months or perhaps even years. Spink's victims of choice are typically dogs and horses. With no interest in humans to distract him, he threw himself at his studies. He graduated at the top of his class in high school, receiving an undergrad in cultural anthropology from Reed College and his MBA from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, one of the top 3 business schools in the country. While he was attending the University of Chicago, he began working for a couple that bred golden retrievers. In exchange for his labor, they provided him a room in their home. It was during his time there that he met his first wife, Judy, who had a partnership stake in the couple's breeding business. Eventually, Spink had a falling out with the couple when they discovered he had been physically abusive to numerous dogs. The following is the only known archive of an email from the man whose home he lived in. It was in response to an inquiry by an animal abuse organization investigating Spink in the year 2000. As far as I can tell, the only known archive of this email is contained within the Holy Tomb known as Encyclopedia Dramatica. Quote, "He lived with us in our Elgin, Illinois home for over a year and married my former partner in top brass retrievers, Judy. I saw a very alarming side of him that scared me, and I asked him to leave our premises back in August of '94. His abuse to animals, and he has an uncontrollable temper that frightened me. I felt that he was a dangerous person to my dogs. The details you presented in your conversation with Bill Freeberg are pretty accurate. When he went to University of Chicago Graduate School, starting in the summer of '93, I invited him to live with us in exchange for caring for our dogs when we traveled, etc. He lived in a spare bedroom in our home for just over a year. During this time, he met my former partner, Judy, and while we were wintering in Florida during the winter of '93-'94. The dogs involved in this partnership were all registered with he and I as co-owners. I started getting complaints every time Douglas would come to a competition, and then several other incidents occurred that made me want to dissolve this partnership. I asked him sometime in September of '94 to sign my dogs back to me and to please move from our home. I offered to help him find other accommodations, but he was furious and ended up moving in with Judy and her 2 children who still lived at home. One of the problems that disturbed me about him was his uncontrollable anger towards dogs and people. While caring for our dog during the winter, I got notice of a possible lawsuit by a local couple. Note, name will not be published here, who had delivered a bitch to be bred to one of our males. This bitch almost died as a result of a punctured lung. Records can be verified at Dundee Animal Hospital, where the dog was treated. I also found out about several of my own dogs that he had admitted beating up, supposedly when they disobeyed him. It was at this time that I decided to ask him to leave our home. Judy gave me a deposit at that time for a pup from a breeding that she liked. I refused to sell them a dog on the premise that I thought Doug was abusive to animals. She was furious about it, but I stuck by my decision and did not sell them a pup. This email was sent in the year 2000, and the site that it was archived on is now defunct. When Judy split from Top Brass Retrievers, she and Doug started their own breeding business. He also bred, trained, and traded champion show horses. One of particular importance was a young Holsteiner he acquired for approximately $27,000 named Capone, whose harrowing story is tragically and inextricably tied to Spink's. In the same way child predators will insert themselves into careers that allow them to be around children in positions of authority, Spink inserted himself into a life that would allow him to be around a steady supply of defenseless, trusting animals. Spink and his wife moved from Chicago to Oregon, and he would go on to earn millions during the dot-com bubble. He was also an avid fan of extreme sports, particularly base jumping, which could very well play a factor in the risky and frequently criminal endeavors throughout his life, constantly seeking the next adrenaline rush. I'm no psychologist, but you all are of course free to make your armchair diagnoses in the comments section and argue amongst yourselves. At some point during the height of his career, around the turn of the century, he was outed as a zoophile, causing the complete deterioration of his marriage. He claimed he was outed by a fellow zoophile who contacted everyone in his life and ruined his SEO by causing any Google search of his name to return results exposing his degenerate crimes. In reality, he was outed by a watchdog group that had noticed an alarming amount of bestiality available on the burgeoning web, and one name that kept popping up as an owner for the various sites was Douglas Spink. His wife didn't leave him, at least not on paper, and it seems the only people who actually found out about his crimes were the people he told about himself out of fear of being outed. Due to the fact that he was worth millions, his wife kept her mouth shut, I presume under the condition that he stop abusing animals. Even had she decided to report him to the police, bestiality wasn't a crime under Oregon law until 2016, so legally speaking, he would have suffered no consequences. The couple separated but stayed legally married, living in different houses. Spink lived in their small mansion in Gaston, Oregon, while she stayed in the smaller family home not far away. Eventually, his house of cards came tumbling down on top of his head, and he lost every penny he had earned when numerous fraud judgments were granted against him. He only spiraled even further into debt by trying to sue his former employees and refusing to dial back his lavish lifestyle, regularly hosting parties that would go on for days. Believe it or not, this dog rapist wasn't the most honest or ethical of businessmen. But, as with every hardship he faced in his life, his financial woes were blamed on malicious outside actors who had set him up. Mysterious Chinese-born businessmen who fabricated and sold stocks of a company he was trying to sell, or some such nonsense. The courts, of course, found him liable. In addition to the angry creditors and investors he had defrauded, he owed large sums of money to many friends and family members, at least $80,000 to his own mother. In 2002, he filed for bankruptcy, and his business partner, feeling sorry for him, began making the payments on his Gaston mansion. This arrangement lasted a year, with Spink never even making an effort to pay a single penny in rent before his partner ceased payments, and the magnificent home was foreclosed on. Spink decided to flee to Canada in 2003 before his bankruptcy case could be processed by Oregon courts and the fist of the law could be brought down on his head. He completely abandoned his wife Judy, as well as their stepchildren, who were all undoubtedly safer without him around. Before leaving, he confronted his wife, demanding his favorite dog, a golden retriever named Rion, be returned to him. She declined, and by his own admission, he threatened to violently end her life. Quote, "I told her that I would gut her like a fish and hang her from a tree by her intestines if she didn't get Rion back to me in 24 hours. Terrified, she obliged, and so Spink made his escape, but not before trashing the Gaston estate. According to the later homeowners, quote, "The elaborate brickwork was marred by gallons of paint. Windows were smashed. There were gaping holes in the walls and ceilings, and by the shape, she guessed they'd been made by a bowling ball thrown against them. Fuck you was smeared on the walls in dog feces. The couple's adult children moved in with them for 3 years to help repair the place." Left without a pot to piss in Canada, he decided to try his hand at a different line of work, one that would make his extreme sports hobby and penchant for fraud look like a walk in the park. Drug smuggling. He hooked up with a woman named Corinne Super. He claimed that she was a career criminal who recruited him into the drug smuggling world. But again, if his lips are moving, then it's very likely that he's lying. And she's always denied his claims. nor to my knowledge has she ever been arrested for any such offenses. Spink and Super met and bonded in 2003 over their mutual passion for equestrian sports and horse trading, and he eventually began living with her husband, and their small child, though he stayed exclusively in the barn with his dogs and the horses. One of his horses was the champion show jumper Capone, who was allegedly worth upwards of $5 million at one time, and who he would later go on to describe as the love of his life. In the barn, he set up his workstation, from which he ran several bestiality sites, often recording himself abusing the animals and uploading the files for the viewing pleasure of his fellow deviants. According to Spink, he eventually began a sexual relationship with Super, even proposing marriage at one point, claiming she was aware of his animal abuse but didn't mind. According to Super, who was married at the time, he was full of shit. Quote, "Doug always made it very, very clear to me that he was gay. I certainly have it in letters. I have it written that he wanted to be very clear that he wasn't misleading me, that there would be no chance of any kind of a romantic thing with him." Furthermore, Super says that at one point in time, the RCMP raided her barn, seized all of Spink's computer equipment, and began investigating him on charges of bestiality. An investigation that she assisted in by identifying him as the man in the bestiality videos that he had produced. From 2003 to 2005, Spink worked as a drug mule smuggling cocaine and marijuana across the Canadian border into the US. It was during his time smuggling drugs that he first began posting pseudo-anonymously about his lust for animals on the internet under the handle Fausty. His proclivities were mentioned frequently and unabashedly on the recreational drug forum bluelight.org, where he was at one time an admin, as well as the aforementioned Beast forums, where he would post explicit images of himself raping his dogs and horses. In 2005, having drawn the ire of the United States federal government due to the large sums of money he owed before skipping town for Canada, an investigation was launched into his whereabouts, and a bolo was issued. A red flag was thrown, and the feds began tracking his movements after he was discovered empty-handed hiking along a known drug smuggling trail. He was subsequently arrested while attempting to smuggle nearly $35 million of cocaine from Canada to Washington State on February 28th of 2005. Needless to say, he made the headlines. Facing 10 years to life for the charges, he managed to score a plea deal for 3 years in the pen and 5 years supervised release for helping to bring down cocaine kingpin Robert Kessling, who was sentenced to 17 years in prison with Spink's help. During his time in prison, Corinne Super took custody of his dogs and horses. Spink claimed that he was simply leasing the valuable horses to her as a payment for the debts he owed her for looking after all of his animals for the duration of his incarceration, while Super claims that he traded them wholesale to clear his unpaid debts to her. Whatever the case may be, during his time in prison, their relationship deteriorated, and by the time he was released, it had become flat-out adversarial. The feds who arrested Spink, having creamed their jeans over scoring a cocaine bust in the neighborhood of 400 pounds, were content to overlook his strange behavior towards the female German Shepherd that was accompanying him, as well as the stickers on his car that they would later discover covertly indicated that he was a man-beast love activist. This information wouldn't surface publicly until half a decade later. After serving his 3 years, he began leasing and living in a barn in the tiny town of Custer, Washington. The property owners lived on the same tract of land, and to my knowledge, were unaware of his proclivities. Super had returned his dogs, but kept the horses, having had their ownership legally transferred to her during Spink's time in the clink. It was during one of his raging phone calls to Super that his golden retriever, Rion, was mauled by Spink's other dogs over food he had left out on the countertop. He'd stepped out of the house to yell into the cell phone, and he returned to find the poor animal a bloody mess. It died a few days later at a veterinary hospital without ever being given the chance to find a loving home. After many months of heated arguments, Super begrudgingly returned to Capone. However, due to his legal ownership having changed, Spink could do virtually nothing with the horse besides sexually abusing it. In 2008, Super hired a team to sneak onto the Custer property to take back Capone. Upon discovering his prized stallion was missing, Spink filed a police report, which made the news, where he claimed the horse was unjustly stolen. After the true facts came to light, that Super couldn't actually steal a horse that she legally owned, Spink took to myhorseforum.com to try and clear his good name, providing no convincing facts. You would think someone like Spink, routinely engaged in crimes against man, beast, and God, would be smart enough to have at least a modicum of OPSEC when posting on the internet. Of course, he did not, and included the Fausty handle on other forums where his real identity was no secret, and it eventually became public knowledge that he was a zoophile. Immediately after posting on My Horse Forum, the name Fausty was tied directly to Spink, and the entire forum began to ridicule, ostracize, and threaten him, more than likely reporting his activities to his local police. Today, he would tell you that he wasn't outed by his own stupidity in this way. He was just proud of who he was. But that's nothing more than a coping mechanism. As he has proved time and time again, he is incapable of accepting his own failures. Despite the apparent public knowledge that he regularly engaged in animal rape, the police continued to pursue the investigation into the theft of Capone. But before it could be completed, sometime in late 2008, Spink snuck into Canada and stole the stallion back himself. He then went into hiding. Bankrolled by his mother, he purchased a 22-acre property with a small cabin in the town of Sumas, Washington, near the Canadian border, 30 minutes away from the Custer farm. There, he would keep his half-dozen dogs and numerous horses, all of which were subjected to regular abuse by Spink and other zoophiles he pimped them out to, advertising his dilapidated home as a sort of animal brothel online. 1 year later, towards the tail end of 2010, Spink once again made the headlines. It would be the most popular story of the year for every Washington newspaper, and this time, the sick truth would be revealed for the entire world to see. On top of being one of the sickest people I have ever come across, and despite his high IQ, Douglas Spink is a mentally ill, reckless, arrogant man, and it was his blatant overconfidence and unearned superiority complex that would ultimately lead to his perpetual entanglement with law enforcement over the past 15 years. While most of you, like me, probably aren't familiar with the history of the zoophile community, a good majority of you will get a sudden flash of PTSD when I mention a video titled Death by Horse or Mr. Hands. Even if you aren't what I would describe as an online person, it's one of those shock videos that manage to pervade the normal sphere, a la Two Girls, One Cup. Recorded in 2005, the video depicts a Boeing engineer named Kenneth Pinion, who went by the moniker Mr. Hands on the internet, receiving the violent love of a fully grown stallion with the assistance of two friends, which resulted in his death. One of his two co-conspirators dumped his corpse at the Enumclaw Community Hospital. The identity of the man who left Pinion to die was never discovered, but the identity of the other man visible on the film was. His name was James Tate, a truck driver and owner and operator of his own personal bestiality farm in rural King County, Washington, where other men would regularly visit to engage with sex and animals he kept on his property, as well as each other. Apparently, it was a widely known and highly regarded destination on bestiality websites. A perfect weekend getaway for the closeted animal rapist, as Washington state had no laws against sex with animals at the time. The night of the incident, Tate's horse apparently offered too much resistance to being sexually assaulted by the men, so they resorted to their backup plan. As they'd done many times before, the trio trespassed onto the unsuspecting neighbor's farm and assaulted their horse. Contrary to the poetic and beautiful love that the hosts of Zooier Than Thou spend hours waxing poetic about on their podcast, male horses don't just willingly engage in sex with humans. These degenerates would rub female pheromones on themselves to coerce the beasts into the act. Tate took his turn without suffering any fatal injuries, but when Pinion took his, the animal annihilated his colon, causing his death. Soon, investigators uncovered Tate's identity and the nightmare that was taking place on and adjacent to his farm. Unfortunately, due to the lack of legislation prohibiting the sexual assault of animals in Washington, prosecutors could only convict him of criminal trespassing. He received a suspended 1-year sentence, meaning he served no time, a meager $778 fine, and 8 hours of community service. There were silver linings to the case, however. First and foremost, Kenneth Pinion suffered a painful and embarrassing death. All of the animals were rescued, and the following year, in 2006, Washington state would go on to finally draft legislation classifying animal rape as a Class C felony, punishable by up to 5 years in prison. It was Doug Spink's relationship with James Tate that would result in his being publicly outed as a depraved zoophile, and his return to federal prison. Were there any justice in the world, he would have died there. Immediately after performing his community service, James Tate fled Washington state, likely in fear for his life after the events that transpired in Enumclaw became the subject of national headlines. Understandably, the community was out for blood, enraged that he managed to escape with no more than a slap on the wrist. He made his way to Maury County, Tennessee, where he set up shop on the farm of a fellow zoophile named Kenny Thomas. It should come as no surprise that he immediately began raping animals again. Even if he'd been sentenced to a decade in prison, there is no reform or redemption for any of these monsters. They fall squarely under the same umbrella as pedophiles and often commit the same offense. In October of 2009, police were tipped off about this bestiality farm. It was subsequently raided, and both men were arrested. Kenny Thomas was charged with 2 counts of felony animal cruelty, James Tate with 3. It was 4 years, nearly to the exact day, that he had been charged with trespassing in Washington state. It's at this point that the timelines of Spink and Tate begin to converge. In the same month that Tate was arrested in Tennessee, Spink had just stolen back Capone and moved to a secluded cabin in Sumas, Washington on the Canadian border. 5 months prior, his probation case had been reassigned from the old veteran officer that he had built up a rapport with to a much younger, much more tech-savvy up-and-comer. The reason for this transfer was that his case had gone from high risk to low risk, which indicates a huge lack of diligence from his first supervisor. Ironically, this switch would help to ensure that Spink was brought to justice. Like any moderator on the internet, Douglas Spink felt imbued with a sense of power that came from his various virtual janitorial positions, and he would torment the users of nearly every site he frequented with the gruesome details of his sex life. He claimed that he could bury his enemies using his best weapons skill, an unending tsunami of words. Had he not spent his life dedicated to abusing animals, he may have had a promising career as a Reddit moderator. Despite being universally despised, it seems that he genuinely began to believe he was some sort of activist, a crusader seeking to bring justice to his fellow oppressed sexual predators. Eventually, this attitude and false sense of power began to bleed into the real world, and it's for that reason that he reached out to James Tate, who was awaiting trial in a Tennessee jail. Despite no legal training, Spink offered assistance in his case, having apparently seen Tate as some sort of role model. Tate returned his correspondence, his reply dripping with the paranoia and delusions of a criminal who knows his days of freedom are numbered. Quote, "D. Spink, Sir, I was quite pleasantly surprised by your letter offering help when it arrived last night. No, things have not yet been resolved. Things are just slowly picking up steam, as someone is feeding the media little tidbits of meat until the vultures can dine off the main course. Us. As far as the farm, no one is watching it, being that they've confiscated everything with 4 legs from the property. They euthanized it for Kenny, but it still means the same thing as far as the disposition of all the animals. They've murdered them, with the claim all those animals were too dangerous to be around people now. Bullshit. They received the death penalty. Their crime? Just being our close friends. Friends that both cared and loved each other. How true that they're all dead is real or not, it is what the officials told Kenny." Spink had grown used to his moderation powers on the internet, combating those who would question his disgusting lifestyle with walls of pseudo-intellectual dribble. Under the delusion that this was an effective tactic, he began employing it on the jail staff and the public defender's office. He wrote the following to the attorney assigned to defend Tate, quote, "Mr. Tate has also informed me that he, personally, has no documentation from you or anyone else relating to his case, the charges under which he is being held, or anything else. Apparently, in the solo meeting you've ever had with him several weeks ago, you flashed a copy of several warrants at him, but refused to give him copies of same. He sits in jail with no reliable explanation for why he is being imprisoned. Either behave as a professional and an officer of this court, or expect to face any and all sanctions appropriate for such failures, both with the judge, if there even is a judge, in the current case, and with your state bar association. I don't have time to play games with you. Mr. Tate rots in jail while you dither, and his possessions and non-human companions are scattered to the winds. If you think I speak lightly in promising to ensure that you are held accountable for your failures as an officer of this court, I suggest you find a few minutes in your busy schedule to validate that assumption on your part." While most internet users are content to ignore or troll someone so stupendously, outrageously stupid, government officials and employees don't take lightly to threats, no matter how empty, especially from a felon who is unabashedly defending the innocence of a known animal rapist, as well as the act itself. Spink pestered them night and day, and had many phone calls with James Tate. Those calls were of course recorded, and in them he outright admits to practicing bestiality, ironically now a crime in his own state thanks to Tate. He also told Tate that he was preparing for government agents to kick down his door, though there is no indication of whether he was serious and was purposefully trying to get caught to become a martyr for his cause, or was simply making an offhanded joke. A detective for the case, Terry Chandler, sought to file a no-contact order against Spink, and found that he was a felon currently on supervised release with the Federal Department of Probation. Chandler relayed this strange and erratic behavior to Spink's new probation officer, Jeff Robson, who immediately began an investigation. It didn't take him much Googling to discover that Spink was known online as Fausty, and had a huge online footprint that provided a veritable mountain of evidence proving that he was raping animals, among other less significant probation violations that would likely have been dismissed on their own, such as traveling to speak at the Last Hackers on Planet Earth conference in New York City without notifying his federal probation officer. The rambling, disjointed, borderline incoherent speech he gave was uploaded to YouTube, providing irrefutable proof that he had traveled illegally, as well as the fact that he did indeed engage in and advocate for the rape of animals.
Also, I live in Washington State on a farm, and I guess I'm kind of unusual. This actually ties into how I approach corporate law, and I'll try to convince you of this. I have kind of an unusual lifestyle in that my primary physical, emotional, and social bonds are with horses and dogs. So my family is really mostly composed of dogs and horses. My life partner, who I've been with for 10 years, is a famous athlete and very successful, has his own fan club, and pays a lot of the bills around the farm actually with his work. He's also got 4 hooves and a tail. He's a show jumping stallion named Capone 1. Anyway, he was actually kidnapped 2 months ago and is being held for ransom right now. And that's a whole nother story. If you want to Google my name, you'll find all that stuff out. It's quite a freakish deal. And by the way, all the advice from the last session about how to deal with the press, that's really good advice. It's really good advice. Because I've been interviewed on ABC News and everything else about this thing lately. Front page of this Globe and Mail in Canada, blah, blah, blah.
The gruesome nature of his crimes were not taken lightly, and on April 14th of 2010, his rundown Sumas cabin was raided by authorities, and both he and the man visiting his property were arrested. He was found to be living with more than a half-dozen large breed male dogs and 4 horses, including the prized Capone. There were also a dozen field mice, which were slathered in some sort of petroleum-based lubrication. The same lubrication was present on 2 of the large dogs as well. He was running an operation similar to that of Tate's in 2005, advertising his home on various sites as a place for other zoophiles to visit and rape his animals. The other man that was arrested that day was Stephen Clark, a 51-year-old British sex tourist who had made videos of himself engaging in receptive sex with at least 3 of Spink's dogs. The two had met online, both men frequenting bestiality forums and chat rooms. During one scene, Spink enters the room to gloat about the sexual prowess of his dog. According to court transcripts, the conversation went like this. Spink: "Aha, caught in the act. I shouldn't be surprised." Clark: He feels a lot bigger than those shepherds." Spink: "Yeah, I've warned people about that. Not you. You don't need to be warned. But you can imagine people used to shepherds stumble into him thinking, wow, he is not a big dog. Only one person, Yipping, tied with him before. I'm never doing this again." The conversation ceases for a bit and then picks back up towards the end of the recording. Clark: "Well, in terms of sexual performance, he's certainly on par." Spink: "No doubt. That has never been a weak spot for him." Clark: "Oh damn, I didn't know it. I just made a lot of mess." Spink: "The good news is, in the context of the existing, muddy, filthy mess that is my cabin right now, it's not even." Clark's laptop was also found to contain child pornography, and upon running a thorough background check, it was discovered that he was a convicted child rapist, had produced CP, and had numerous charges for assault and burglary on his record back in the UK. Another colossal failure by the US government. Clark was sentenced to 30 days in jail before being given over to the feds to be brought up on visa and immigration violation charges. They toyed with the idea of throwing the book at him before finally coming to the conclusion that he was the UK's problem, opting instead for deportation. Spink was not initially charged in Whatcom County. He was instead handed off to federal courts, who found him guilty of violating the terms of his supervised release on the 2005 cocaine charge. He was sentenced to another 3 years in prison, with another 2 years of supervised release tacked onto that. He contested the seizure of his animals in a civil suit, and thankfully lost custody of every single one. Capone was eventually given back to Super, never again to be within arm's reach of Douglas Spink. One of the horses he had purchased locally, Little Joe, was returned to its original owner, and the other 2 were sent to a horse rescue foundation. All 7 of his dogs were sent to the Whatcom County Humane Society, with several of them showing extremely aggressive behavioral issues. He served 2 of his 3 years in prison before being released during July of 2012 to live in a halfway house in Seattle for the remainder of his sentence, with special conditions including heavy surveillance and a ban on internet access, though he was allowed a cell phone. 5 months into his stay at the halfway home, he was remanded back into custody before being transferred to Whatcom County to be formally charged with 3 counts of animal cruelty stemming from the raid of his cabin in Sumas in 2010. They had initially declined to prosecute his case, as the burden of proof required to convict him of violating his supervised release for the 2005 drug smuggling charge was far lower, and the main priority was getting him away from the animals he was abusing. Spink's utter lack of remorse for his crimes, his repeated and flagrant violations of the terms of his release, and his outspoken advocacy for the abolition of laws prohibiting bestiality under the guise of being a persecuted minority had made him a target for all branches of law enforcement, every person working in animal welfare, as well as the general public. In his arrogance, he believed that he would have the relatively recent Washington state statute overturned by fighting the state charges. He was formally charged by Whatcom County in December of 2012. He pleaded not guilty on all charges, promptly posted his $5,000 bond, and began looking for a new place to call home while awaiting trial. That home would of course have to comply with the updated, incredibly strict terms of his supervised release, and given the fact that up until that point he had only flew under the radar due to the sheer negligence of the United States federal government prior to the 2010 raid, I'm sure you can guess where this is going.
Donate money or even a manual typewriter to me for your only hope for a future.